Thank you. Hi everybody, my name is Jen. I'm a front-end developer at Catalyst IT. So just a few disclaimers before we get started. Who am I to be talking about this subject? I'm not a genius. I'm not a 10x engineer. I'm just another developer looking on. And I'm giving this talk in the developer track because it concerns our whole community and not just the specifics that I'm going to be talking about today. Also, this is the first time I've ever given a culture talk at a conference. I normally go for more technical talks because they're safer. So fingers crossed I don't get myself into any trouble today. We'll see how we go. So just a brief content warning before we get started. Nothing too severe, but I do want to say that we are going to be talking about some aggressive language in the talk this morning. And I've definitely avoided the worst stuff. But we are going to be looking at the opinions of some people who are ideologically opposed to codes of conduct. And some of those people are not so polite, let's put it that way. I have censored any swear words, don't worry. And if you do want to leave because you think that might make you uncomfortable, I'm certainly not going to hold it against you. Right, so. Let's talk about, oh, hang on, slides, how do they work? Come on. That is very weird. So, okay, there we go. Technology, how does it even? Let's talk about Linus Torvald. Creator of Git, famous open sourcer, kind of the reason we're all here in this room today, right? And also, Linux's benevolent dictator for life. Although perhaps maybe actually not so benevolent. It's an open secret in the Linux community that Linus has an abrasive manner when dealing with code review comments. I mean, surely that's not a big deal. It was pretty bad though, swearing at people, insulting their competency, even wishing that they were never born, and that's the polite way of stating it. I'm not going to give you examples. There are plenty out there in the wild. What's important here is that over the years, some good contributors have tried to push back against this behavior, and they got hounded out of contributing to Linux kernel development at all. And this went on for years, years and years. But seemingly out of the blue, in September last year, Linus wrote this in his normal release notes message. My flippant attacks in emails have been both unprofessional and uncalled for, especially at times when I made it personal. I know this was not okay, and I am truly sorry. I need to change some of my behavior, and I want to apologize to the people that my personal behavior hurt and possibly drove away from the kernel development entirely. Now, this is a good apology for several reasons. It's not a faux apology. It doesn't indulge in any of that, I'm sorry that you feel that way nonsense. It admits fault. It acknowledges that just an apology isn't enough and that he will attempt to fix his behavior. And most importantly, it was accompanied by a concrete change. At the same time as his apology, this happened. We got rid of the old wishy-washy code of conflict that implored contributors to, in the words of Bill and Ted, be excellent to each other and not much else. That old code of conflict was in place for 3 years, but it doesn't look like it had really any effect. There's still some quite vitriolic discussion, and no developers were disciplined for abusive comments. Instead, we end up with this, the Contributor Covenant Code of Conduct. So for those of you that don't know, what is that? Well, it's a Creative Commons licensed document that can be used by open source projects to pledge an intent to welcome and value all contributors and to treat them with respect. code of conduct is not about an advance of progressive or left-wing politics. It's about establishing a minimal level of civil and professional collaboration. This is from their FAQ. Civil, non-discriminatory, and professional behaviour should be a baseline and a shared value held by people of all ideologies, regardless of political affiliation. Now, I can hear some of you in your heads right now thinking to yourselves, well, surely that's obvious. Surely we don't need a document to tell us this. To you, I have to say, sadly, don't read the comments. I did read the comments on this change, so you don't have to. Here's a small sample of a couple of comments from that thread, a very long thread with a lot of comments on it, by the way. Please don't let this neo-Marxistic, compelled speech, gender feminism, equality of outcome get even near the Linux kernel. Once they get a foot in the door, Linux will be done. Punch-in-the-face-driven development works. Real comment. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have the people who are just, they're deep out in the weeds somewhere. I don't know what they're thinking. From my point of view, if the code of conduct remains, it means that the Linux kernel has been compromised and could start spying on me in the future. So, much as many of you are doing right now, this was pretty much my reaction. I mean, what even? There are a few more structured responses, but I'm really not exaggerating when I say this is a pretty representative sample of some of the wingnuttery. It's really not surprising that Linus wants to distance himself from these kinds of stances. And in fact, in an interview with the BBC, he said the following, about the same time as his apology. I absolutely do not want to be seen as being in the same camp as the low-life scum on the internet that think it's okay to be a white nationalist Nazi and have some truly nasty, misogynistic, homophobic, or transphobic behaviour. And I don't know about you all, but I read that and I got some warm, fuzzy feelings. This is genuinely awesome. It was so good to hear somebody who is a leader in the tech community saying this publicly in 2018. So this is really good. However, why Linus's apology is actually maybe not such a good apology after all. So we've already seen that it brought all of the trolls out of the woodwork. Let's forget about them and focus purely on his actions. Now, I know for a fact that some of you will have heard the initial news splash about his apology and then not heard much of what came afterwards. But it turns out that the timing of his apology was unfortunately rather cynical. It was published a handful of days before a big New Yorker expose. And for those of you not familiar, the New Yorker is a very reputable publication that does good journalism. And this was their headline. Oops, sorry, too far. After years of abusive emails, the creator of Linux steps aside. And in that article, they said the following. Torvald's decision to step aside came after the New Yorker asked him about his abusive behavior discouraging women from working as Linux kernel programmers. Now, this does make the whole apology seem a bit more pro forma for PR reasons, right, rather than a genuine statement. I personally don't think it totally negates the value of what he said. Most of what was in the expose was already quite an open secret, so it's possible he could have just doubled down and kept on doing what he was doing. And I really hope that other open source project contributors will no longer be able to point to him and say, he behaves like this, so why shouldn't I? And I hope that the kernel community will enforce their new code of conduct, and this will result in less bullying and greater participation. It's been a while since September. What have the effects been so far? And has the introduction of the code of conduct made any difference? So Jonathan Corbett, one of the folks who signed off on the code of conduct change, commented back in September, "The written code was changed with a single patch. Implementing that code may be a rather longer and harder process." And he had quite a really good article, actually, where he talked about the fact that maybe this wasn't the code of conduct that he would have gone with necessarily, but he felt the time was right and this was a good step in the right direction. Now, as we've already seen, there was a lot of immediate pushback, and many who were vehemently opposed to the changes even went so far as raising the spectre of these open source developers rescinding their licenses. Having said that, though, and that was a headline at the time you might have read about, it does appear that this threat doesn't really have any bearing on reality. There's some technical detail that means that although, yes, sure, there are some situations where you can revoke your license, it has to be for a particular reason, not just because you feel like it. And that's good news for us as open source developers, because that could crumble the foundations of what we've been building for the last decades. And actually, the person that was really pushing this idea of rescinding contributions turns out to be specifically a known troll on the kernel mailing list who's appeared on their kill file multiple times. So they definitely had an axe to grind and an agenda to sell. Now, outside of this hatred, this vitriol, it found a focus. And you might think that that focus would have been Linus. I mean, he's the bad guy that who made this change happen, who stepped down and put up the code of conduct and said, okay, we're doing this. This should have been a great step forwards for the Contributors Covenant itself. And although in some ways it was, sadly that's at a personal cost for its originator, Coraline Ada Emker. She received death threats over this, and during a high-profile defacement of linux.org, she was doxxed. For those of you that aren't familiar, that means that she had her address and personal details published, specifically for reasons of harassment. So that's kind of awful, to be honest, and I hate that this is a thing that happened in the world. Meanwhile, back in the kernel project, with version 4.19 of the kernel, the code of conduct is officially in the kernel codebase, along with one extra document, this code of conduct interpretation. Now, this seems to be a document to sort of try and placate some of the naysayers, to be honest. So it looks like the team have gone through the more sane feedback they got about pushing back on the code of conduct and sort of trying to just say, hey, come on, guys. That's not the reality. This is how we're going to do this thing. And, you know, there is going to be due process. This document has a quote that I found particularly telling. It says, first and foremost, it is a reasonable expectation to have maintainers lead by example. So that's great. They're acknowledging that Linus was an instigator of some of this bad behavior, and they're saying that they're going to hold him to a higher standard in future. Now, less pleasingly, unfortunately, the link to the list of people that actually deal with and process code of conduct reports is broken right now, so that's a little bit sad. I should probably write them an email after this talk and say, hey, please fix this up. So what is a newcomer's experience to the project? While the code of conduct may have made a splash in the existing community and in the peanut gallery, it's still probably not yet having much impact on potential newcomers. It's listed in the docs intended for new kernel developers, but the mailing list, which is the main source of some of this discussion that's problematic, their FAQ currently has 0 results if you search for code of conduct. And in fact, they have a Q&A bit in there that says, that their list is not moderated, which is still technically true. You can have a code of conduct and have an unmoderated list still. It just means that if things get out of hand, you do have a point of escalation. So anybody who is new to the mailing list is not going to be advised that their behavior is going to be held to a certain standard. And also, people coming to the mailing list are not going to know that other people on the list are going to be held to a certain standard. But hopefully, it's easy enough to fix that stuff up. And I think they're just products of this being a relatively new thing for the community, which, given time, should get bedded in a bit more gracefully. And at least for that broken link, as I said, I should probably try and get that fixed. It's open source, right? We see a problem, we try and fix it. So what about Linus himself? He's back at the wheel. He spent a little over a month off, stepped back from the project, but he's back doing his thing. Now, has his behavior changed? So here's a message of his from this December just gone on the mailing list. Yeah, this is complete garbage. We have very clear rules. Your behavior is entirely out of line, and now we apparently have a regression that goes back to June that I was not told about because of your incorrect stance. So this is quite clearly the message of somebody who's upset, right? We can read between the lines and we can see that. But it's clear in comparison that with some of his past behavior, he does now seem to be avoiding personal attacks. He's saying that the product, the code, is not good, and that he wishes this person would do something differently in future, but he is not telling that person that they are personally a completely wrong person, or calling them names, or doing any of that nasty stuff that he was doing before. So this does seem like a bit of a change. And a change for the better, I would say. And furthermore, this proves something else. It proves that the trolls are just wrong. I can certainly say that all of the slippery slope fearmongers that insisted that the introduction of the code of conduct signaled the death knell for the quality of the Linux kernel are mistaken. Linus is certainly still going to tell you if your code or behavior is not good enough according to his standards, okay? So they were just wrong. The kernel is now one of over 40,000, actually I looked and I saw over 50,000, projects implementing the contributors covenant. I hope that this is part of a wider sea change in open source culture and community and projects. And that's one of the reasons that I'm talking about this in this track, not in the kernel miniconf. You can help. If you are part of an open source community that doesn't have a code of conduct, and you have the leverage to do so, because let's be honest, some of us have more leverage than others, why don't you suggest adding one? And once it is added, make sure that you're helping to enforce it. You have to walk the walk as well as just talk the talk. Thank you for listening.